Americans who went to Europe, both during World War II and in my own lifetime. And a lot of American soldiers who went to Italy in World War II said that they saw nothing there that impressed them till they got to Germany. In Great Britain, things were just dirty. Of course, by the time we arrived, Great Britain had been bombed pretty badly. France, they saw a lot of poverty and a lot of filth and a lot of slums. They got to Germany and they saw a lot of well-kept-up fields, well-kept-up houses, straight roads, autobahns, superhighways. If you know anything about German autobahn, they're straight as a stick. Now, I'm not saying we should do that. And if they have 40 miles, where do they curve? They go for miles without curving. Then when you get to a curve, they'll warn you ahead of time that there's a curve coming, and everybody just slow down and take the curve. There's no speed limit. You're for it and go as fast as your car will go in German autobahns. But even in the 1880s, German people began to realize, hey, we're cleaner, we're more industrialized, we're better than our neighbors, and they began to develop a sense of superiority that was to be their undoing later. The Chinese had the same issue, a feeling of superiority. And anyway, the feeling that we cannot lose a war because we have the biggest army. Germany had that feeling. And one of your classmates walked out when I said that first class. Anyway, every nation that has been conquered did not think it would happen to them. All right. In Germany, though, they were in somewhat turmoil because a lot of people began to see through socialism and began to hope that somehow it would not take over. Also, a strong anti-Semitic feeling began to develop in Germany. And all of you, I think, know the result of that, the strong anti-Semitic feeling that was to eventually lead to the Holocaust in World War II. All right. Austria had what they call a dual monarchy. In other words, one king ruling two countries. Dual monarchy. One king ruling two countries. But they had problems. They didn't speak the same language. The people were not as nationalistic. And also they had some parts of Austria were industrialized, other parts remained behind. The king ruled like an autocrat. Their emperor, Franz Joseph, governed for some 50 years, and he was conservative. Now, what started World War I was when Franz Joseph's son, the heir to Austria's throne, and his wife were shot dead. And that was what the event that started World War I. So Austria is, if you look on the old maps, Austria was huge. Now look on the map today, and Austria is next to Switzerland, and they're both really tiny. Switzerland, a small country, so is Austria. But in that day, at that time, it was looked big because it was consists of both Austria and Hungary. Let's see. Russia became more autocratic while the rest of the world was becoming more democratic. In the late 1880s, there was an anarchist movement, actually early 1900s, where they said the best government was no government, called anarchy. If we get rid of government, all of the world's problems will be solved. And these anarchists went around assassinating leaders. They killed the American president, William McKinley. And then they killed the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Alexander III. In the case of Alexander III, he had a gun pointed at him early in the morning. He survived it. He had another attempt on his life in the midday. He survived that. But then late in the day, a third attempt, and the third attempt got him. You may wonder why didn't he stay inside after 2 attempts on his life, but that's something else. But Anyway, Alexander, and when Alexander III died, and this name I want you to remember, Tsar Nicholas II. Now, he is the one who was he and his family lined up in front of a firing squad and shot dead. Tsar Nicholas. Now, he was first cousin to the King of England. He and the King of England both descended from Queen Victoria. They were grandchildren of Queen Victoria. But the royal line of Russia had a genetic defect that is believed to have made them somewhat insane, and Peter the Great was probably criminally insane. Nicholas II was descended from Peter the Great, and Peter III, he definitely was insane. Peter the Great's grandson. He was definitely insane. But they had some kind of a genetic defect that they carried with them. And some people believe that this genetic defect led the Tsar into making bad decisions. But the Tsarist Russia repressed labor movements, tried to put down rebellions. Then, in 1905, now folks, this is going to become important later, Japan invaded and defeated Now, why is this important to us? Simply, here's this. Russia was humiliated, but Japan made a sneak attack with its navy. 1905. And again, it was a case of, just like the case of when Ethiopia beat Italy, it was a case of an African country defeating a major European country. Well, here was an Asian country, and up until this time, the Asian countries had not won, but here was an Asian country defeating a major European country by making a sneak attack and humiliating the Russians. All right, does anybody recall when was Japan to make another sneak attack? Pearl Harbor in 1941, and yes, a lot of the Russians in 1941 remembered, hey, we did it in 1905. A lot of them were still alive. We did it in 1905, let's do it again. So Japan made a sneak attack on a big country in 1941, namely the big country was the United States, thinking that it worked then, it'll work now. But they were dealing with the United States and not Russia. It didn't work then. But anyway, in 1905, the place was Port Arthur. I'm not going to write that down, but Port Arthur, the Tsar was Nicholas II. And again, Nicholas and Russia felt very humiliated. And Russia withdrew from politics. Social revolutions came along the scene. And Nicholas II would crush the revolutions firmly. And at one point, Nicholas II killed the brother of Lenin, a young man named Lenin, who is a brother of the Lenin. Lenin himself, the one who led the Communist Rebellion, fled to Switzerland and stayed there until 1917. When in 1917 he was put in a railroad car and sneaked back in. But Lenin remained on the sidelines, waiting for the opportunity to crush Tsar Nicholas, which he finally did. Tsar Nicholas, it has been said that if he had been the younger son instead of the older son, if someone else could have taken over as Tsar, maybe things would have been different. That Tsar Nicholas was really not suited to be Tsar. He was suited for court life. He was suited to attend parties and entertain ambassadors, diplomacy maybe, but not suited to be a Tsar. The word Tsar has come to be associated with absolute autocratic rule. All right. The Franco-Prussian War ended in 1871, and the point I want to make, folks, 1871 to 1914. We're talking about a period of 43 years. Europe was largely at peace, except for uprisings in Russia and a few places. But Europe was largely at peace during that time. Now, 1914 is the date I really want you to remember. That's the date World War I began. But the peace was finally broken in World War I, which is a subject for a later chapter. All right. Germany, having defeated France, had France as its enemy to the west. Then Germany made enemies with Russia to the east, so Germany had enemies on both sides. This is to be very important because one of the reasons Germany lost both world wars was they could not fight a two-front war. They were fighting both on the east, fighting against Russia on the east and against France on the west, and they simply couldn't. And in World War II, Hitler's generals warned Hitler, hey, we can't fight a two-front war. We tried that last time. Hitler went ahead and invaded Russia anyway. I mean, I'm jumping around in the story, I know, but you'll be seeing these later. But Germany had enemies on all sides, and they simply couldn't handle it. All right. Back to science now. We went so much for politics for a while. The scientific method became very, very prominent. Europeans began to say that science explains everything, and everything can be based on science alone. Reason, science, progress. They were important words in the European vocabulary. And they believed that science would bring about, through its reason and rationality, would bring about progress. Science became hard and cold. After all, science had created the telephone, the telegraph, the locomotive, the airplane, and had made. Now, folk, they began to believe that science would eventually explain everything in the universe. And I remember my high school science teacher, Mr. Taylor by name. Again, I have no idea if he's still alive or not. All my teachers would be really old by now, but Mr. Taylor said the time might come when we would explain every phenomena in the universe. Today, we're not so sure. A lot of scientists are ready to throw up their hand and say there are some things that are just not going to be explained. There are some things that we may never understand. But nevertheless, they believe that sooner or later, particularly this time, we'd explain everything in the universe. All right. Into this scenario came Max Planck. Max Planck. Max Planck studied, he took up where Marie and Pierre Curie had left off. He studied radiation, and he said that radiation was random. That there was something going on inside the atom that made radiation, particularly I'm talking about radon and uranium. Radiation is random, and this led to quantum. Quantum physics or quantum mechanics. Now, basically the quantum is the study of subatomic particles. In Switzerland and France, there's an underground collider machine that can accelerate particles at a tremendous amount of power. And they are in search of the ultimate particle called the Higgs boson or God particle. Are any of you aware of this? The Higgs boson, the God particle, the big collider, CERN. That's the name of it, CERN. Most of you have heard of CERN.
Is that the one called
superconductor? Yeah. It can collide particles at a very high rate, and from these collisions they can study what the effects are, and then figure out what was going on a subatomic level from these collisions. And Russia has thought about building an even bigger collider. But anyway, now this brings us up to another great man of the time, Albert Einstein. Yes, Einstein was a Jew. There's been a lot of stories told about Einstein. And one of his sons one day wrote a book, which I happened to read, saying, I want to correct this, but Was Einstein ever kicked out of a class for asking too many questions? The answer is yes, at least once. But there are stories, I mean, he's known for his ingenuity. When he died, he gave him permission to take his brain out. And they found out that in the front part of his brain, he had more connecting neurons than most people do. And that might explain why that he was so good at mathematics. And yet, a lot of the equations that he came up with, well, there were some equations that we work today at college that he could not work. He could not, he had his limitations, as did the rest of them. And about limitations, for all of his ingenuity, there is a story going around that one day, Einstein bumped into a man and said, "Listen, please, can you help me? My name is Albert Einstein and I'm lost. I can't figure out where my apartment is, so can you please help me find my way home?" He was in his own neighborhood, you see, and he couldn't remember where his home was. This story is told. I mean, it sounds like somewhat of a crazy man, and yes, some of the things he did were the type of thing that would be done with a person lacking intelligence. And yet, he tried to explain the universe, and explained the universe in such a way, I mean, that people would listen. There have been a few men down through the ages who have explained the universe in such a way that they got the people of many generations to believe them. Plato was one. Newton was another. Einstein was another. People who could explain the universe. Well, he tried to explain the universe, and he spent the last years of his life working on trying to explain everything. But he's famous for his theory of relativity. Relativity, that all motion is relative. All right. Again, I've read several books about this, and I have no idea how much you younger people are interested in Einstein. But supposing someone were going off in this direction at 186,000 miles an hour, and someone were going off in this direction 186,000 miles an hour, how fast would these two people be going relative to each other? Anybody know? Anybody at all? The top speed in the universe is 186,000 miles an hour, so they'd be going at 186,000 miles an hour. Now that does not apply to slower speeds. Like if one car is going at 60 miles an hour, and another one's going this way at 30 miles an hour, they're going apart at 90 miles an hour. But when you get closer to the speed of light, a strange thing has happened. One thing that happens is time stops. Yes?
Yes, this thing do happen in space, like when we use the telescope to see those lights from the universe, but we found all the light speed, they are the same.
All the light, when we're heading toward an object, the speed of light is 186,000 miles a second. We're heading away from it, the speed is still 186,000. Yes. Yeah, you're on the same page I am, yes. The speed stays the same, and Einstein tried to explain it, so but eventually his equations led him to a very important equation. You'll see E equals mass times the speed of light squared. This put energy and mass in the same equation. Now, we unified electricity and magnetism and found out that magnetism is electricity, electricity is magnetism. But now we've got mass and energy, or energy and mass in the same equation, which means that we put together energy and mass. A little bit of energy can give off a little bit of mass can give off a whole lot of energy. I'm getting myself mixed up. A little bit of mass gives a whole lot of energy. And this, by the way, led to the invention of the atomic bomb. It might someday put us into space, and if you ever watch Star Trek, they unite matter and antimatter, and put matter and antimatter and give a tremendous explosion that can get their spaceships moving at quote-unquote warp speed. Now that's still fiction, of course. But what we have done is we have gotten ion thrusters, and ion thrusters now being used on interplanetary satellites to move our spacecraft from one asteroid to another, and ion thrusters can be used for years without running out of fuel. Again, has its origins with Einstein. Einstein's equation led to the atomic age and eventually the atomic bomb. Now, Einstein was a Jew. When the Jews started being persecuted in Germany, he was allowed into the United States, and unfortunately, most Jews were not, but he came to the United States and became an American citizen, and he wrote a letter to President Roosevelt encouraging Roosevelt to develop the atomic bomb. Now, today's young people are not as interested in relativity as my generation was. When we read about it and talk about it, and the generation ahead of me, they would spend a lot of time talking about it. Einstein eventually found himself outside of mainstream physics. Physics moved on and left him behind. But in 2005, 100 years after Einstein, it said, today's physics projects consist of teams of men and women working together. Some will come into the project and some will leave the project, but it's not a matter of individuals anymore. It's teams of people working together. And a lot of what Einstein taught us has been somewhat undermined, but not completely refuted. Oh yes, as objects approach the speed of light, they get heavier and heavier, as well as time slows down. This has been proven with sending satellites into orbit going 5 miles a second and carrying atomic clocks. The atomic clocks will slow down relative to the clocks on Earth that are not going 5 miles a second. All right. I think only one of you can really follow me when I talk about Einstein's theories. The rest of you, well, I'll move on. Something that most of you might know more about, Sigmund Freud. I had his name up here at one time. Sigmund Freud has been said that he was the most maladjusted man on the face of the earth. And he got involved in psychology, like so many of them do today, to solve his own problems. And he began to apply science to the study of psychology. He eventually found that the human mind does not lend itself to mathematical equations like as the hard sciences do, chemistry and physics. That the study of psychology is somewhat nebulous. But he developed psychoanalysis, and that's one thing he's famous for. Psychoanalysis, where that you ask a person questions and you analyze what that type of person is based on the answers that they give. He believed that the subconscious controlled a lot of our lives, that things that happened to us before that we can't even remember in our childhood controlled us the rest of our lives. And if we had a bad childhood, now, here's the bad news. Sigmund Freud taught us to blame our mothers for all our problems. He did. And I'm not, in no way do I advocate that at all. No way. If you blame someone else for your shortcomings, that's a surefire guarantee you'll never solve them. You won't solve your problems until you realize, I have met the enemy, and it is me. But Sigmund Freud taught us to blame others, particularly our mothers, for what's wrong with us. And left a lot of people, well, you know, I can't help what my mother was. Well, that might be true, but that doesn't mean you cannot overcome. Now, Sigmund Freud, at one point in his career, he believed that the main thing a man wanted was sex. And a lot of his psychology is based on sex. But then, he wound up changing his view later and said, no, what a man really wants is respect, to be respected. But anyway, each of you can make up your mind for yourself. A lot of what Sigmund Freud taught has been known, is now known to be untrue. And again, if any of you studied Sigmund Freud, if you studied psychology, you know what I mean. A lot of it has been undermined. But one thing he said, and this is something I think about a lot, the behavior that you hate the worst in others. All right, anybody know what I'm about to say? What do you know about the behavior that you see that you hate the worst in others? Anybody can guess? You're probably doing it yourself and don't realize it. Yeah, you hate somebody for what they do hate. Look at yourself. Are you doing that to other people yourself? Sigmund Freud told us we were. This you'll find in any I've seen it, well, I haven't read that many psychology books, but that is still taught. And in most cases, that he was probably right there. In a lot of what he has taught, and I could go into more detail, but the subconscious, yeah, he believed in the id, the ego, and superego. The id would make us do things that we shouldn't do, but then the superego would come in and stop us from doing those things. That's why we can't allow a person who's influenced by drugs to play like professional baseball. A player might get hit by a player on another team and he might feel like punching him out, but then the higher reason, whoops, I better not do that. But if he's under the influence of drugs, his inhibitions are lowered, he'll go ahead and punch the other player out anyway, and then have to take the consequences for it. These drugs lower your inhibitions and make you do things that you'll regret later. Things you would not do. All right, now we come to social Darwinism. Social Darwin. All right. There's more I could say about Freud, but I just don't feel comfortable repeating it in mixed company, so you can look him up for yourself. But anyway, social Darwinism, they began to use Darwin as a means of putting competitors out of business. And they believed that the strong should eliminate the weak. And in particular, two American business tycoons did this, actually there were three, Carnegie and Rockefeller. Rockefeller, once he got his business established, he would control every bit of oil production. He would control it when it came out of the oil fields. Then he controlled the shipping from the oil fields to refineries. He'd own the refineries, and he owned the shipping between the oil field and refinery. So he didn't have to make a profit. See, he didn't have to make a profit in mining it. Didn't have to make a profit at the refinery. Didn't have to make a profit shipping to the refinery. Didn't have to make a profit distributing it to the warehouses. He only made a profit when it came to the end. But by the time he got to there, he was putting out oil cheaper than anyone else could. So he could put out oil cheaper than anyone else could. But then he put his gas station, Rockefeller, put his gas station next to someone else's, and then got involved in a price war. Now, none of you have seen a price war. Well, gas stations get involved in a price war where they each of them try to go lower and lower and lower and lower than the other one. Each of them going lower than the other one. And eventually, Rockefeller, would put the competitor out of business. Then once he put the competitor out of business, he could raise the price to any price he wanted to. The price would go up really high after the competitor left. And he put many of his men out of business, and he used Charles Darwin as a means to justify doing so. Now, eventually the federal government moved in and passed antitrust laws. The big businessmen, the monopolies, were called trust. Now, if any of you have played the game that was popular in the 1930s called Monopoly, where if you can get control of the railroads, you will likely win. All right. That's been my experience anyway. But sometimes you can't get your chip to land on the railroads. But the idea was you'd put the other man out of business. And they believed that the way to improve the human race was to eliminate the weak. Racism then became a prominent feature of thought at the time, and especially this was true in Germany in a negative way. The Aryan race was called the superior race, the master race. And the Germans were the only true descendants from the Aryans. Now Hitler believed this. Now, again, the Aryan race that they depicted does not exist, never existed. The real Aryan race went into India and conquered it, set themselves up as the head of the people of India, and they were white and the people of India were black. But then over time, the Aryans themselves became black because they intermarried with the local population. That's the story of the Aryans in brief. But the Aryans that Hitler depicted, they were the master race. All right. Okay, I'll tell you. How many of you know who was Hercules' father? Anybody remember from Hercules? Zeus. Every ancient society believed that beings from the spirit world came to earth and intermarried with human beings and produced a race of giants. This is even found in the Bible, Genesis 6 among others. The most famous giant of all time was Goliath. Gilgamesh could pick up 2 lions by their hind legs and hold one in each hand. Gilgamesh was about 13 feet tall. Gilgamesh was 2/3 God and 1/3 human. All right. Hitler believed that the Aryans were descended from the unions of gods and humans. Again, it's a non-existent race. Now, each of you can make up your own mind what you believe about whether or not spirit beings cohabited with earth women. I mean, each of us, I'll say this, I can't prove it to have happened, but I can show you from the records, every ancient peoples believed that there were once giants on the earth. Every one of them. Hardly any exceptions. And again, you can take from that what you want to. The inferior races were the Jews, number 1, the Africans and Orientals, numbers 2 and 3. The Jews were accused of wanting to destroy the Aryan race, so the Jews were forced to flee to ghettos. The word ghetto means people who are thrown together because of religion or ethnic group. The Jews went to ghettos, and oftentimes they were subject to pogroms. Pogrom was an attempt to eliminate Jews. Many Jews came to the United States, but some of them began to trickle in towards Palestine and began to settle in Palestine in a movement that is known as Zionism. I'm about to finish the chapter, folk, and then I'll close. The Catholic Church, which had opposed Copernicus and opposed Galileo, went ahead and told its people they could teach Darwin and teach evolution. I'll leave it at that. Now, the art of this later period, and I'm talking about the really late 1800s, early 1900s, they left realism alone, left realism in the camera. Now, the only painting in what you remember about, Vincent van Gogh, and he painted Starry Night.
Yes.
Starry Night, and we can tell what night he painted it because of where the planet Venus appears in the sky. So we can stand at the place where he stood and look over the town he was looking at, and we can actually tell. He didn't tell us when he painted it, but we can tell because of where the planet Venus is. But Starry Night, the stars are going around and around in curly cues. Vincent van Gogh. Now, as was the case of so many people who become famous for this, for art or music or literature, Van Gogh became a dope addict, a substance abuser, call it what you will. And he started off as a preacher, I believe a Methodist preacher, but he eventually left the ministry became an artist. He made some money painting portraits of other people. But he got deeper and deeper and deeper into his melancholy and depression, which he tried to solve by drugs. And the drugs only made his problems worse. Pablo Picasso, modern art. Picasso tried to paint mood. Again, they were leaving realism to the camera and tried to paint mood. Picasso painted particularly against World War I because he did not like the idea of war. All right, folk, this ends chapter